Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good early morning, good middle of the night. I don't think we have too many people here middle of the night. I'm Rachel Scheiderman. This is my Jewish Learning's Daf Yomi Week Enlightening Review. We'll be here for the next half hour, zipping around the first few pages of Bava Kama. We're in a whole new universe this week, aren't we? And we are joined this week by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. I saw some nods to Rachel's "We're in a whole new universe." So I'm feeling it too, if you're feeling that. It's still Talmud, so it rings familiar, but it's a whole different place from where we've been. Um, a few things just to note as we start. As you know, as we've said, we started a whole new Seder Nizikin, which is Nizikin is called damages. There's really a lot of uh, civil law. This is the Seder about civil law, and much of it is what the rabbis call dinei mamonot, like monetary law, financial law, which has to do with property law, damages, things like that. There's also, we'll get to dinei nefashot. There's some capital crimes that are discussed later on, but we got some months to go before that. Some will say in an educational setting, when you're starting to teach people Talmud, this is the Seder where you should start. Why? Because the topics here are familiar, meaning, I don't know, you might not have had an ox, come and damage your fence, but, the neighbor kid or, or a squirrel or someone's car, I don't know, something, right? We know about damage to our fences. We've all had lost items and need to know about when you need to return them or not. And some say because of the topics that are here, that they relate to everyday life, right? They don't involve so much theology. They don't have anything necessarily to do with your religious practice. So to say, here's a set of laws that relate to everyday occurrences that happen. And this is a place to start teaching people who are new to Talmud because the content will be familiar. And through then we could focus on how do the rabbis uniquely talk about that content and how does the Gemara work as a discursive text. And when you're bringing someone into the text, some people say, start here in Nizikin. And as a result of that, there are many curricula out there for kids and adults about various chapters in Nizikin, which we're going to encounter in the days and weeks to come. But we're starting Bava Kama. We've started already. I guess we're a week in. It's a sprint, right? We're ready. We just started, but we're all week in already. And today I want to focus on the opening Mishnah and compare it a little, and the part of the conversation about it, and compare it, which actually the Gemara does too, to one discussion we've seen and one discussion we have yet to see, which has to do about the rabbinic notions of categories. So as you know, our Masechet starts with Arba'a Avot Nizikin, right? There are 4 categories of damages. And some will tell you, and there's a truth to this, that right, rabbis like categories, they like lists. We see this, right, the term avot in the Mishnah and the Gemara refers to categories. There are a number of areas of law that have categories. And the categories help us organize the material, right? If we have 4 different kinds of damages, one might think that that means there are 4 clear areas of law that we're going to deal with over the next chapters, or in this Masechet, and they will frame for us the different worlds we're going to live in, right? The ox, the pit, the maveh, and the fire. There's a clue already in the Mishnah, or maybe the commentary about the Mishnah, depending on where you're studying it, that something different's going on here from what we've seen before, because you might have noticed it in how I said it, and if you read it, you would know too. There's the ox, the pit, the fire, and the maveh, right? 3 items that have, 3 nouns that have words in English. They have Hebrew, cognates also that we use, in the Mishnah. But maveh, untranslated in many of our translations, Not because the word doesn't have a translation, but because, as we find out with this week, this category of mavet, there's not agreement about what it is. Right? We have the category of ox. You might think at first that damage caused by animals, right? An ox as the prototype animal, right? Pit, damage caused by inanimate objects that don't move, right? A pit sits in one place, like you fall into it or stumble into it or drop something in it. It doesn't move, right? Fire, sort of, I would say inanimate object because not thinking, but it's in some ways fire is animate, but object that moves, like because fire once it lights, it takes on a life of its own, causes its own category of damage. So fire is different from it. And then we have this thing mavet, which we're not sure what it is. Um, and we learned this week that one position says, well, this is actually damage from people, right? When humans cause damage, it's its own category, which would be great because that's a whole different category from the other three categories, right? People are animate like animals, but the rabbis and people, right? We have a people bias. We ascribe intelligence to people that we don't ascribe to animals in the same way. So we would hold people more accountable than animals. So that, but yet the other opinion says maveh is tooth. So then we have what do you mean tooth? Because we have ox, right? Ox, pit, fire, those represented things. How is tooth a different category? Like it sort of sounds like ox, but only a small part of the ox. And those that say maveh means tooth, they subdivide the animal category into things like a tooth, right? The animal's tooth, the animal uses its teeth to eat. So the category of tooth is when the animal does something it gets enjoyment from and causes damage. And then the category of just ox are things where just the animal gets destructive but gets no benefit of it. It's a little, I guess, animal behavioral psychology that leads to two different categories of damages. But are you ready? You see, just from listing the four categories and trying to explain them, there's something funny going on here because one of the four categories we don't know exactly what it is. And it's not just that we don't know exactly what it is. The two rabbis that have this debate that I was just describing are Rav and Shmuel. They were first generation Amoraim, meaning the rabbis right after the Mishnah was codified, and each of them were students of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi at some point in their lives. So they studied with the people who put the Mishnah together, and within one generation, they already don't agree on what the Mishnah means about this one category. Something a little funny is going on here about these categories, which we'll circle back to in a minute. Now, you might remember, if you've been with, well, it depends. You might know several lists of categories. If you started Daf Yomi at the beginning of the cycle, you'll remember Masechet Shabbat, which also has a list of avot, right? In Masechet Shabbat, we learned 39 categories of labor that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And the other category that we're going to come to, well, that's mentioned on the first page, and we're going to come to a little bit later, are the categories of impurity, right? The types of categories that take something pure and make it impure by coming into contact with it. And we're going to see those categories later on in the Talmud, but they're mentioned today. And I mention these different systems because you might think when the rabbis use the word avot, when they use the word categories, we could say right? When the rabbis have categories, all the lists of categories work the same. So if we know how categories work in one instance, we can apply it to another instance. And I wish I could say that that was true. But what I'm here to say today is that's not exactly true. And not only does, do we know that, but the Gemara knows that too. Because the Gemara, when it opens up its discussion of the Mishnah today, it's going to do two things that are typical Gemara, but tell us a lot about what's coming this Masechet. The opening question, there are two opening statements, I guess, the Gemara makes on this questions about the Mishnah. The first statement says, from the fact that the Mishnah teaches that there are primary categories, by inference, there are subcategories. So when I read that, I said, okay, that rings familiar with me. The Gemara does that a lot. If you have categories, says the Gemara, well, we must be able to subdivide those categories into other categories. If you're a category person, that could make sense. Or if you're a different kind of category person, it might not make sense, right? I have a t-shirt drawer. Some of my t-shirts go in the t-shirt drawer, but all of my t-shirts go in the t-shirt drawer. And for many people, that might be enough. Me too. I have a t-shirt drawer that has all my t-shirts. My sister, when she was growing up, also had a t-shirt drawer, but her t-shirt drawer was organized by color. So if you opened up her t-shirt drawer, the blue t-shirts had a pile, and the red t-shirts had a pile, et cetera, et cetera. Because she had subcategories for her t-shirts, and I did not. Uh, my mom had different categories. She had categories of t-shirts, like any t-shirt that came from a Jewish institution that had Hebrew letters on it or some kind of Jewish phrase. Those you could never give away, to Goodwill when you grew out of it or didn't want to wear it anymore. It went to the special Jewish t-shirts box that we discovered in a closet recently because, Jewish t-shirts you don't give away, and right, secular t-shirts you can give away. I'm not sure the logic of that, but that was just her categories, right? So some people just have t-shirts and some subdivide, but the Gemara assumes once there's categories, they're going to be subcategories. And that's where the trouble begins. Because then it's asked this weird question. Are the subcategories similar to the categories, or are the subcategories different from the categories? And I don't know about you, but when I read line 2 of the Gemara as we started this new Masechah this week, I was like, what? We're going to do that? We have categories and subcategories. Are the subcategories the same or different as the categories? What could we be talking about here? But then the Gemara digs down into that and says there's actually, based on how the Talmud deals with different sorts of categories, it's not such a bad question. Here's what I mean by that. I'm going to go back to Shabbat and the categories we talked about there, right? The rabbis list 39 categories of labor that are the labor we rest from on Shabbat. So we say we rest on Shabbat. What does that mean? There are 39 things we can't do. And if you remember in Masechet Shabbat, they asked, well, right, they said too, there are categories and there are subcategories. And we had many chapters that picked a category and talked about all the subcategories of that category. And they asked there too, are the subcategories like the categories, or are they different from the categories? And there were two opinions in the Gemara about this. One train of thought said, well, the subcategories are similar to the categories, but what makes the different buckets is if you do an act on Shabbat that has multiple violations, if all the violations are in the same category, you're only on the hook for sacrifices as if you did one violation. But if you do a violation from two different categories, two different boxes, you have to bring two sacrifices, right? So the rabbis say the rules of Shabbat divide up the categories into sort of infraction zones. And so, planting seeds is one of the categories. And a subcategory of that is like watering growing plants, because so there's a similar theme. But if you plant seeds and water plants and water them on Shabbat, it's not two infractions, it's only one infraction. As opposed to, right, there's planting seeds and then there's also tanning leather. You plant seeds and tan leather on Shabbat, you're on the hook for two things. So on Shabbat, one of the perspectives is the categories are similar behaviors, and how are they useful to us? If you do two things in the same category, you've done two things in the same category, but you only have to bring one sacrifice, because if it's one act, because in doing them together, you've really only done one thing, the one category violation. If you violated two categories, you violated two categories. That's one way to think about it. There's one rabbi who disagrees with that and says each infraction needs its own sacrifice. And they say, well, what does he make of all these categories? And that's where we get another explanation that we use all the time for Shabbat, which is the 39 categories for Shabbat all come from the construction of the tabernacle. The things that the Israelites did to build the tabernacle, that's what we rest from on Shabbat. And the category names are the actual things they did to build the tabernacle. And the subcategories are similar things, but just that you didn't do to build the tabernacle. Those are the two approaches. For me, the Shabbat categories line up nicely. We have 39 buckets. Each one has a theme. The subcategories are similar to the theme. We differentiate between what's the title of the category and the subcategories by the tabernacle. And our accountability for actions on Shabbat is based on which categories things live in. And this is a way where the rabbis say the subcategories are similar to the categories. Awesome. I loved that on Shabbat. I didn't love all the chapters where we went through them all every minute. It got a little repetitive for me. maybe for you too, but there was a nice sense of here are these categories, they line up. There's a similarity between the subcategories and the categories, and only if all the categories work that way, things would be great. But it doesn't turn out that to be that simple. The next, I'm going to skip over the next list we encountered is Bava Kama, which is now, I'm going to skip over to the categories of impurity. The categories of impurity also have their categories. They list different objects, a dead body, a creepy, crawly reptile or thing. They're not all reptiles, I don't think, right? There's a list of things that cause impurity. And each of those categories have subcategories too. But there's a difference in the laws of impurity between the avot, the titles of the category, and the subcategories, different from Shabbat. What we'll learn more, we've had hints of this as we've encountered purity and impurity sprinkled throughout the Talmud. But when we get there, we'll see more that the categories of purity, the names of the categories of purity, the avot, have the highest level of purity, right? The most impure things, or the strongest level of impurity, are the things that are the names of the categories. And if you were to touch one of those things or come into contact with one of those things, you get a first level impurity from them. And then you become impure and you're a second level impurity. And if you pass that impurity on to something else, it goes to a third level of impurity. And with food and some other things, there's a fourth and fifth level of impurity. We'll get to the details of that later. But unlike the laws of Shabbat, where each thing was just a different action, the laws of impurity in those categories, the names of the categories represent the most contagious or the strongest forms of impurity. And if you touch them, you're impure at the highest level, and your ability to transfer that impurity is at the highest level. And when you go to the subcategories, they're less powerful, less strong. It's almost like radioactive elements after they've decayed, right? The heads of categories are the most radioactive, and the things that are listed in the categories are sort of decayed, so the radiation spreads less. And the rabbis say these are categories where the names of the categories are different from the subcategories. How are they different? They are weaker. Well, the names of the categories are stronger and the subcategories are weaker. So while you have categories of things, but impurity gets you can trace every impurity back to the actual thing that started it, the 7 heads of the categories. The things that fall into the categories are things that have gotten impurity from those original things, which aren't the same as those first things. A different kind of use of categories, which now maybe brings some insight to the question we asked today, or this week: are our categories in Masechet Baba Kama the same as Shabbat, or are they the same as Nezikin? And wouldn't it be great if the answer was one or the other, so at least have a model? But as you know, if you've read the text, and if you hadn't, I'm going to tell you, the rabbis say in some way, some of the subcategories are the same and some of the subcategories are different, which means now we're in a space, these categories that we have are not like exactly like Shabbat and not exactly like Nezikin. They're sometimes similar and sometimes not similar. And that leads to some of what I experience as like the messiness of this opening Eric, where while the Gemara was familiar and rang familiar, felt like, oh, this is Gemara. It's like Gemara I've seen in other places, right? The terminology is similar, the nature of the argumentation is similar, the topic is different, but the way in which they're dealing with categories felt different to me in that the categories don't feel as clean to me as Shabbat, which is what the rabbis acknowledge in this opening discussion. Also, the derivative categories aren't derivative like for impurity, where there's a clear way things get passed down. And so there's this almost lack of clarity about what could fall where, especially in places, that goes back to the debate I started with about the Maveh. Meaning, if we don't know what the Maveh is for sure, and as we're still standing, right, I'm a little bit ahead, because as I'm writing for the Daf Yomi email that goes out, I got to stay ahead for the publication deadlines. Like there was just something that came up that's going to come. It's not really a spoiler alert, but where they said, well, if you follow Rav or you follow Shmuel, you're going to have something different about this discussion based on what you think about what Maveh is. So it seems that this Maveh question isn't going to be resolved anytime soon, if at all, which means damage caused by animals with their teeth could be in one category or could be in another category. We don't know. We don't agree. And in some level, to me, it doesn't seem like it matters as much as maybe the categories in the other two areas I described today. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with this opening to the Masachet that's giving us an organizing structure, which can be helpful and in some ways will be helpful. But what I'm feeling and maybe suggesting is that the categories of damages in Bava Kama are not going to be as helpful as organizing structures in this Masachet as they might have been in Shabbat, and they will be in Nizikin, because there's some gray between them. And sometimes the life of the individual prototypes, take on their own. We're going to see lots of things about oxes and pits and fires, right? The things that are categories are going to be discussed, and they're each different in different ways. And there are ways that ox serves as a stand-in for animals, but it's not as clean, right? Because we're going to start to deal with domesticated animals and non-domesticated animals and war animals that have a history of causing damage and animals that don't have a history of causing damage. And well, we're used to the Gemara starting to split things up in different boxes, sometimes without end. Somehow, as it starts to do this in this Masachet, there are ways in which we lose sight of these original categories that the Masachet starts with that doesn't happen in Masachet Shabbat or some places. So in some ways, this opening conversation you might think is going to help you frame what's coming. And in some ways, the opening frame, we're going to quickly move on from. We're going to keep talking about damages, and we're going to keep using these prototypes that we started with. But somehow the nature of these categories in Bava Kama functions differently in the conversation in the Beit Midrash, or at least as recorded in the Talmud. And that's a little bit about what we're going to live through. And at this point, I would say, I don't know, see you at the other end. Let's come back together at the Siyum and see how did this all turn out in terms of the usefulness of these categories, and what and how do you think the rabbis think about categories when they use the term avot? How does your thoughts about rabbinic categories evolve after we've lived in the realm of these categories for I think it'll be almost 3 months. Anyway, some thoughts for the beginning of Bava Kama today. I saw there were some things coming into the text, but I was trying to look at the 30 faces I have on my screen and not those. But I want to use our waning minutes to see what we can tackle.
I think you answered Lynn's question after she posted it, which is if an animal eats something and enjoys it, does that count as ox, which is our animal category, or maveh, which is potentially our tooth category, right? But it might also be our people category. We're not sure. And the answer is we're going to have to sit with that uncertainty for a while because we still don't.
It depends if you're in the camp. For one position, any damage caused by an animal is in the ox category, and the other position is eating or behaviors that you get enjoyment from fall in the maveh category, and other damage is in the ox category. But I guess the question I have for Lynn and for all of us and for the Gemara is, does that differentiation really matter, in 20 pages? Or are we just going to start talking about oxes and the damage they could cause? And will the categories fall away because of this because these categories are less clear or have lots of options? Is it just easier to talk about, the case of the ox who does this? What do we do without worrying about what category it's in?
And Lynn says, if my cat urinates on your rug and ruins it, she's actually enjoying it, I promise. So, okay.
Yeah. Right. Well, in terms of right. In terms of right, the psychology of animals and what do they really enjoy and
Yeah.
there's some interesting things about it. In some ways, the rabbis were really attuned to animal behavior because they were much closer to the agricultural society and the animals that came with it than we are.
Yeah.
But yet, I think our understanding of animals has developed some. There we
Yeah.
go.
And
Um,
I'd like to highlight Robert Starr's comment. He says this is about how to think, not only buckets. Yeah, for sure. We have a really interesting article on our website. I will try and find it and share it in the next 4 minutes. It's by Rabbi B'nai Lapé, who makes, I think, the strongest case I've heard anyone make that the Talmud is not about practical what you should do. It's not going to give you those answers. It's about training legal minds
yeah,
when there's a case to be made for that, especially in how often they don't come to an answer.
yeah. And I think what with that point here is right the while the categories of Shabbat could be clearer, right? The categories of here of damages are messier, and I think that's true in the case law also. Like, is something a violation of Shabbat? We can analyze in a certain way, but what's actually the damage here and who's responsible and for how much? It's a little messier. It makes sense to me that the categories are a little messier here because I think the sorting out sorting out the results of things is sorting out what we should do, sorting out the implications of the law is messier.
Yes. And so I've linked. I'm sorry, I was looking for the piece and not listening
Oh
to
yeah,
you.
I
I'm
saw it.
sorry. I've linked Rabbi Lapé's piece, so I apologize if that's repeating what you said. And yes, this she makes a very strong case. I don't think I follow her all the way in what she says, but it's a very interesting case about what the Talmud really is. Let's see what else we have here. Yes, Shell reminds us that they're male sages who are opining on what women think as well, and assume they know, as if all women think the same thing or all men think the same thing anyway, right? But sometimes we have to make some assumptions. We have to take some educated guesses.
Those questions will come up in Nizikin. Not as much as we lived with those questions much more in Seder Nashim, which we just said goodbye to about the rabbis making assumptions for what women are thinking. It's still a factor here, but we'll be confronted with it a little less directly on a daily basis.
Okay, and Aaron Boxer's reminding us that the rabbis have to work. They can't. They're not inventing this out of nothing. Of course, they're rooting it all in the Torah. They have to work with what they find in the Torah, which is part of what makes the rabbinic project so interesting, that nothing is starting from zero. It's all starting from Torah. Even when Torah itself is not trying to be a complete guide, they approach it as if it's a complete guide, and then they have to fill in the gaps or fix the problems and all kinds of things. Interesting things result. All right. Well, I think we will leave it there. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for highlighting the way that this tractate began for us and some things to keep in mind as we move forward. We will be here a long time, right? Because Baba Kama really is one of 3 linked tractates. They were just too long to call it all one tractate, so they called it, first, middle, last. Do you know, by the way, does anyone know, because I don't, why it's called Baba, like why it's a gate, why that is why it's called that? I don't actually know. If you know, share it in the chat. I don't know. It really means Baba Kama, the first gate, the middle gate, the last gate. I don't know if it's related to the material or, okay, Robert's suggesting it's an entry point. Yes, that's gate in Aramaic. Most words that end with the aleph on the end are Aramaic. That's
sort of an editor's decision in terms of like that it was too long. Like I think about that now, like as for Daf Yomi, I'm studying with the Koren Steindelt's English edition with with the text and translation. Some Masechtot are too long for them, and they split it into 2 books. So Baba Kama, which is was 1/3 of like Masechet Nezikin once, became Baba Kama, but now in the Koren edition, it's Baba Kama A and Baba Kama B, because they're sending out in 2 different books. So like The
Right.
decision Koran's making today is parallel to what at one point we made about taking Seder, Masachet Nezikin, and making it um, three
Yes.
Masechtot. We still do that based on length.
And I think we had a sense that Shabbat and Eruvin are really one big tractate as well. Right. It's just continuing discussions about
Yeah.
Shabbat. So the names don't make that quite as clear. Yeah. So we will be here till December 24 in this material. So plenty of time to get used to it and see all the nuance. I think that's enough for today, though. It was lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for the good discussion and the questions. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for the presentation. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow morning in this space in a week's time, and wishing you all an early Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.